This is the Comics Alternative Manga. Reviews of Verity #1 and Cutie Honey, the Classic Collection. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Manga. I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
And we're two comic scholars who enjoy discussing manga. And on this episode of the monthly manga series, Shea and I are going to look at two quite interesting titles. We're going to begin with a new anthology publication called Vérité, and it's edited by Bharath Murthy. After that, we're going to look at Go Nagai's Cutie Honey, the Classic Collection, which came out in August from Seven Seas Entertainment. But before we get to that discussion, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Manga is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your manga and comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts can be anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover. But every now and again, you can find discounts that go higher than that.
Like this month, you can get volumes of Naoko Takeuchi's Sailor Moon for 25% off, and you can get other manga-related books like Manga in Theory and Practice by Hirohiko Araki, which isn't manga, but it's manga-related. You can get that for 30% off.
Whatever kind of comic or manga you're interested in, you can definitely find it at impressive discounts at Discount Comic Book Service. So please go to their website, dcbservice.com. They will take care of all of your comics and manga pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Shea and Derek sent you. Well, Shea, we're recording this the very beginning of October, but this, I guess, is officially our September show. For at least a couple of months, we were on time, but we fell a little behind for September.
Yes, unfortunately, I've had to meet with students one-on-one in very intensive workshops, and so my schedule has been a little more has been a little tighter than normal, and that coupled with a couple sick days has made recording this with any sort of quality difficult, but we finally found the time, and I think it'll be worth the wait. I
hope so. Yeah. So this will officially be, I guess, our September show, but we will be back later this month, and we definitely will be for the October show, because we're going to be doing. We don't know exactly what we're going to discuss yet, but we're going to do what we've done for the past 2 or 3 years, and that is look at horror titles. This being the month of Halloween.
Yes, it's. I don't think it was ever planned this way, but it's kind of become an annual tradition, and it's one I've come to enjoy quite a bit. So, I think we're going to try really, really hard to get that one out on time.
That's right. Well, for the September and October episode, let's go ahead and get started. And the first title we're going to discuss is something a little unusual. It's the first time we've looked at something like this on the manga series. This is, I don't know if you want to call it a journal or a magazine or just an anthology collection, but it's called Vérité, and it is published out of India, and the editor is Bharath Murthy. Murthy. And there's, I guess, a little backstory that's interesting about this, because I first learned about Verité when our colleague, the co-host for the monthly Euro Comics show, Pascal Hammond, he mentioned this when it was, I guess he first learned about it. He said, oh, you may want to check out this manga publication out of India, he said, of all places. And he gave me a link to, I guess, some information about this online. That either that same day or maybe the next day, I got an email from Bharath Murthy, the editor, who wanted to know if we were aware of this new publication, Vérité, its very first issue. And it was strange because Pascal had just told me about it. And so I said, yes, I had heard about it and we'd be interested in checking it out and maybe discussing it on a future monthly manga show. And so Murthy was kind enough to send both of us copies, and it's impressive, and we wanted to discuss it on this episode of the manga series.
Oh, yeah. I actually I had no idea that you had actually reached out to them for a copy. I thought this book just kind of showed up, and it was a interesting little treasure that had been sent to me.
Yeah. Well, actually, Murthy offered to send us copies and because he wanted us to know about it. So apparently he found out about our manga show and wanted to alert us to this. But again, as fate would have it, about the same day or maybe the day before, Pascal had told me about Vérité. And I think Vérité seems to have a lot going for it and definitely worth talking about. And I said seems to, I mean, this first issue definitely does. I don't know what future issues will look like. Is this a quarterly? I'm not certain. I think it might be, or maybe a biannual. I can't remember. But one of the things that makes this such a unique publication is half of it is composed of what I guess we could call classic manga or older manga. Gekiga by the creators Tadao Tsuge, who we have discussed on the show before. We've also discussed Susumu Katsumata. Remember a few months ago when we talked about Fukuyama Devilfish. But there's also Youji Tsuneyama and Yukichi Yamamatsu. And so those are older mangaka that make up half of this volume. But then the other half are by non-Japanese creators, primarily Indian, but I think that there are a couple of also Western creators, maybe someone from the U.S. and I think someone from France, plus an essay by Ryan Holmberg. Again, another big selling point and something to make this first issue of Vérité notable. And in fact, Shea, did you hear my brief conversation with Ryan when I was at SPX a few weeks ago?
I have not gotten a chance to listen to that yet, but I did see that you had put it up.
Yeah, and one of the great things about this year's Small Press Expo was that I finally got to meet Ryan Holmberg. I communicated with him in the past, but this is the first time that I had the pleasure of meeting him in person, talking with him, not only about this issue of Vérité, but also some of the other stuff that he does, his translation work, his scholarship, his criticism when it comes to manga. I mean, he really is, as we've mentioned on the manga series several times, a giant in the field. So it was a pleasure to meet him and to talk a little bit about this first issue of Verity, which they were selling at the Big Planet Retrofit table.
Oh, I had no idea that it had gotten some sort of distribution in the United States.
Yeah, and I don't know if there was a formal agreement between Retrofit Big Planet and Murthy, the editor-in-chief of Vérité, or if Ryan had copies there that they were selling at the Retrofit Big Planet table because Ryan had also pulled together that volume, The Troublemakers by Baron Yashimoto, that we discussed back, I think it was in June. So, and that was a Retrofit Big Planet book. So I don't know if Ryan was there for that, and had various copies of Vérité for sale, or if Big Planet Retrofit worked out some kind of agreement with the editor of Vérité.
Well, regardless of the distribution of the book, I do think that this is like you mentioned, it's a bit of an unusual title, but it is one that I was really excited to get to talk to you about. So why don't we get into the book itself?
Yeah, and I don't know where you started, but I started with the older, or what we could call more classic works of manga by Tsuge, Katsumata, Tsueyama, and Yamamatsu. Now, one of those stories I was already familiar with, because I started to read it and it had a familiar feel to it. And this is the one by Katsumata, Book of Straw, because this was in the Fukuyama Devilfish collection, right? Yeah,
that's what I thought as well. I was like, as I was reading it, I was like, this seems really, really familiar. And I had known that I had read some stories by Katsumata because we had read the Fukuyama Devilfish collection. But it took me about halfway in until I realized, like, oh, I'm pretty sure I've read this story already.
Yeah. So it was coming to that one again. And, that's an interesting story. And I didn't mind reading it in this collection. I mean, to me, one of the big standouts, and I guess because I enjoy his work so much, what we have of it in translation, and we just recently were discussing his Slum Wolf, I think, for the August episode, and that is Tadao Tsuge. So his story is The Old Woman of Kinkayoa. And basically, it's the story of this young man who resides in a house or an apartment. And there's this old woman who sits out down the street from where he lives, and she's selling candy. Many times she's not busy at all. In other words, people don't come up and buy candy from her, it appears. And she seems to be asleep much of the time, maybe a bit even on the cranky side when he does attempt to talk with her. But he does have, at least at one point, an engaging conversation with her, and notes that she doesn't seem to be the kind of woman that he first thought she was. And through his landlady, this young man's landlady, we learn a little backstory about this old woman and her family, and how she also, I guess she resides with her granddaughter. What's her name? Kuniko?
Yes.
Yeah. And the family,
yes.
Yeah. And the family seems to have fallen on some bad luck. And that's the way, without giving away any spoilers, what happens at the end of this story is that the granddaughter seems to, at least the narrator suggests, escape maybe, or possibly, this bad luck that the old woman's family had undergone.
Yeah, it's interesting that you, I'm curious, why did you make the decision to start with the manga side? Because I read it the opposite way. I started with the stories by the Indian cartoonists, the more contemporary stories, before moving on to the manga.
That's interesting. I guess because with the older or more classic manga by Tsuge, Katsumata, so on and so forth, those were names that I recognized. And so that's why I started there. And we should mention that, this has a flip book quality to it, right? So when I started reading this first issue of Verité, I started from what people may consider in terms of Western readership, the back of the book, and then read from right to left. Now, the collection of at least mostly Indian creators is on the other side how you would read, let's say, a Western text from left to right. And so that's how you started the collection. But I started with the older manga just because I recognized those names and I wanted to see what they, what was collected here. And so it was my curiosity that drove me to read the older manga first. Why did you start off with the primarily Indian creators?
I think for the same reason, but I think, like you, I recognized a lot of the names, especially Katsumata and Tsuge. But I think I was more interested because like we said, I didn't know it at the time, but we had ended up having read the Katsumata story already, and I was familiar with a fair amount of Tsuge's work. So I was I was really interested to see what these contemporary Indian cartoonists were doing, especially after reading. There's a brief one-page editorial at the front of the book. Well, that might be misleading. At the front of the section that's
by Murthy, the editor.
Yeah, that's the section that's read left to right. And Murthy talks about how these cartoonists are drawing on a lot of the ideas, the aesthetics, the storytelling techniques, storytelling sensibilities of a lot of the 60s and 70s Garo, like alternative manga gekiga people that we talk about pretty frequently on the show. And so I think more than anything, I was really interested to see what these contemporary Indian cartoonists, especially since I know so little about, to generalize Indian culture, and Indian comics and what the Indian comics scene looks like and kind of what's going on there is I'm so deeply ignorant of that community or of that industry that I think more than anything I was just really curious to see how these cartoonists were taking those ideas or taking those aesthetics and using them to tell stories about Indian life rather than post-war Japanese life. So yeah, like you, I think my decision was largely motivated by my familiarity with some of those names. But I don't want to say I was turned off by kind of the fact that I was familiar with a couple of those cartoonists, but I think I was just far more interested to see what some of these contemporary voices were saying rather than going back first to see what some of these older mangaka were doing.
Right. And, in addition to Murthy's apparent, deep interest in manga, there is also the crossover that we get in, I guess, the fourth or the last of those older works from the mangaka Yukichi Yamamatsu, because this story, which is Rickshawalla's Shop, is actually translated from Hindi. So apparently this Japanese creator wrote this manga, which takes place in India, in Hindi. And we get even a little background information about his interests in India, in that he is a mangaka who came to India and wanted to establish, so to speak, let's say a manga beachhead, right? Publishing as well as teaching in India. And so there is that Indian-Japanese comics cross there as well.
Yeah, and that's an interesting title because, like you mentioned, most of there's 4 manga stories, and 3 of them are from this. What are the dates on? So one of them is from 1969, one of them is from 1970, and one of them is from, it says, the mid 1980s. But this one that you're talking about, the Rickshawalla's Shop, is actually from 2008. And so it stands out in that way as well, because it clearly has it shares certain thematic sensibilities with the other stories and with kind of other late 60s, 70s alternative manga that we've looked at. But it also it feels very different in a way as well. I mean, aesthetically, it's clearly very distinct from those other stories. And so I think you're right to point to that story as this interesting sort of hinge on which these 2 sections of the book kind of turn, right, where they kind of touch each other in a certain sense.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it, and using that story, the Rickshawalla's Shop, as a hinge, I think is a nice way of putting this. So yeah, I enjoyed the variety in this collection, and with the more contemporary pieces by, again, primarily, not exclusively, but primarily Indian creators. They do have a manga-like feel to most of them. Now, some of the stories are more, let's say, life writing examples or memoirish. And I'm thinking that one that really stood out to me, especially having quite a bit of experience in academia, is Research Ramblings. And this is by Shaunak Samvatsar. It's about a professor, teacher working at an Indian school of directing, and about how he and his colleagues are charged with needing more research and publications. And they don't necessarily want to do that. They want to be more creative. And it's about the ins and outs, the ups and downs of what that means in academia to have to produce that kind of scholarship, even though that's not necessarily where your interests lie.
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting story as well. You're right to point out that it's I think the least like the manga that's included here. It's like you said, it's very memoirish. It's also very what's a good way to describe it? I mean, it's the pages look completely different. There's often, pages with no panels or no panel borders, which is something that we haven't really seen in alternative manga. The characters are more kind of cartoonish rather than like realistic or naturalistic. You have people personified as giant cobra snakes or as sheep. So yeah, I think you're right to point out that this is it stands out from both, I think, the manga here and then all the other comics from Indian cartoonists as well. But it's an interesting title, or it's an interesting story, I should say, because I do think it is funny, and I think it's an interesting look at kind of what's life as an Indian academic or an academic / creative is like. So it was. It was interesting to get that perspective on this sort of thing. Like you mentioned, it's a sort of thing that the academics kind of all over are in a position to experience. But it was interesting to get this perspective. And like you, I think it added like you were saying, it added an interesting variety to the stories here.
Yeah. Now, a second ago I said that the narrator of Research Ramblings was teaching at a school of filmmaking or direction. Actually, I was getting that mixed up with another piece that I wanted to point out. Please do the needful, which is by the editor, Bharath Murthy. In Research Ramblings, the character, I guess, if this is autobiographical, Samvatsar, is, I guess, an animator, but it's a not dissimilar industry, I guess. And so he would much rather do the creative thing than do the research that would go into, well, whatever he needs to get tenure, and what the administrators tell him would bring more prestige to Mega University, as it's called here in this story. But, we have a similar thing going on in Murthy's Please Do the Needful, in that this is also an example of life writing. In fact, it's subtitled A Memoir. And so here we have Murthy, in his narrative, the characters are anthropomorphic. So primarily, I guess, dogs. And it's about what he experiences as a professor at his university, which is the Government Film Academy. And I think he's in the directing department. And it's about not only his engagement with the students, but also some of the frustrations of having to deal with other faculty administration. So, for instance, when Murthy writes about the boring faculty meetings, I can definitely empathize with that. It's something, it's kind of like a necessary evil.
Yeah. I haven't spent nearly as much time in academia as you have, but even in my limited experience, I saw there was some truth to Murthy's story. So it just goes to show you that some of these institutions are very similar, regardless of where they're at.
Right. Yeah. And you're right. There is a lot of truth in what Murthy writes about, but also in what Samvatsar writes about in terms of the whole publish or perish mentality that goes into, modern day academia. I mean, it's not enough, especially at larger universities, it's not enough just to teach anymore. I mean, there are some smaller schools that definitely do not, and I'm not talking about community colleges, but like smaller colleges that do not emphasize research. It's just primarily the teaching. And then if you do the publication route, it's icing on the cake, right? They won't say no, but they don't push it. But I can tell you from experience, every place that I've taught, the emphasis is definitely on the publications. And, that can be, I don't know, it's kind of a two-sided sword. On the one hand, I enjoyed the kind of things that I researched and published. On the other hand, I think the necessity of having to publish in order to be promoted, in order to get tenure, or, to get a good annual evaluation, I think can be a little dispiriting, especially if it's something that you don't necessarily want to do.
Yeah, and I think that's particularly pointed in this story because you have this character. I don't know if we want to say this is autobiographical or what, but
it says it's based on real life events.
Yeah. So I don't know if we want to refer to the narrator as Shaunak Samvatsar, but if we are going to say this is autobiographical, then I think Shaunak's kind of the particular field he's working in, it's even more that idea is even more pronounced, right? Because he wants to teach and he wants to work in animation, and that doesn't really those passions don't really lend themselves necessarily to researching or doing what would qualify as research or academic research for animation, right? He just wants to kind of do the thing rather than and teach people how to do the thing rather than necessarily studying how to do the thing or studying this or that dimension of the field. And so, yeah, I think the kind of things that you've experienced and that I'm fully aware of listening to other people's experience, I think that's even that's even more pronounced in this particular instance here.
Yeah. And then another thing about the research ramblings piece that we've been discussing, I think quite thoroughly, is what happens at the end, because the narrator, whatever we want to call him, meets a former colleague of his by the name of, I guess you pronounce it Sachin, Sachin or Sachin. And he is someone who used to teach, but then because of various life events and also because of an emphasis on research, he decided to leave the field, and now he sells flowers, his family's business. And so that's what he's doing now. And even though he does say that he misses teaching, Sachin, at the very end of this story, he accuses the narrator, because he's doing research, of basically using the work of creators, artists, like animators, I guess, in this case, as the basis for his own occupational advancement without really giving due credit, especially financial credit, to the creators that he is researching. And so it's a form of exploitation, and he curses him out at the end. Sachin does.
Yeah, I thought that was a really good moment. And I liked, we have this last panel where, I need to remind myself of this person's name, where Shaunak kind of wanders off into the distance after kind of feeling dispirited by the kind of truth of what Sachin is saying, and he kind of just wanders off into the sunset a little bit without any clear resolution to this dilemma that he's kind of found himself in. And so I liked that. And I think that's the moment in the text where it kind of most resembles some of the alternative manga that's featured here and that we've talked about elsewhere, that irresolute quality that we see pretty frequently.
Mm-hmm.
So I liked that ending quite a bit, and I thought it was a really pointed ending to this. I don't know if you want to call it a story, because the actual narrative itself is pretty light, but this story, this work, I thought that was a really nice kind of pointed ending
mm-hmm.
there.
One of the stories, actually, it's the one that follows Research Ramblings, and this is Bibaswan Bose's The Student. This, I think, of the pieces in the, we can call it the Indian half, I guess, of Verity, mm-hmm. or mostly Indian half of Verity. The half that you read from, left to right, is the most abstract.
Oh, yes. I think by orders of magnitude, it is. I think it's the only one that doesn't have a clear. Well, that's not necessarily true. I'm looking at this one. What is the name of this one? I think it's the one called No One Knows. That one's pretty abstract too.
Yes.
But I would say those are the only two without clear narratives, without clear characters. It's very, very, very abstract.
Right. That's one. But one that maybe not as abstract as the two that we just mentioned is Anpu Varkey's Night Swimming, which actually opens this collection.
That's another one that I think was one of my favorites from the collection. And you're right to point out that it is a little more. I don't want to say abstract, but it is ambiguous. There's not, you don't really know these characters' name or what their relationship is or what they're doing. Really, you just kind of follow them through this short sequence. But I really like that story. Actually, did you? How did you find that story?
What, Night Swimming?
Yeah.
I liked it. I mean, there's something rather calm and elegant about it.
Mm.
And I mean, in essence, it is a story, I guess, if we want to call it a story, of two young women, and we don't know their relationship. They seem to be living together, but we don't know if they're friends, if they're lovers or sisters. We're not entirely sure. But the essence of this piece basically is just the two of them. It opens with them talking, and I think they only talk at the very beginning of the piece. And then we see them together in various contexts, like out for a walk or sitting on the side of the street. And it ends with them, as the title suggests, swimming in, I guess, a lake at night.
It's. I like that you said it's like a calming, and I that was the kind of the feeling that I got from it as well. It's very still. It's very quiet. Like you said, there's really one line of dialogue on the third page, and that's it. You just kind of follow these characters as they walk around, and then as they sit on a bench, and and then as they go swimming, and it's there is something interesting about choosing that story to start this collection, because it's I don't want to say it's kind of tonally different from the other stories, but it's kind of placid in a unique way that I think makes it a good sort of palate cleanser for the rest of the stories in the collection.
Right. And I have no clue if there's any link between the title of this story and the song, but ever since I read this, I can't get REM's Night Swimming out of my head.
Well, I don't know.
It's very peaceful.
I don't know what the popularity of REM in India is. I don't know if that's if that's like a reasonable connection.
Yeah.
But maybe.
Now, the longest story in the Indian, again, if we want to call it that, half of this first issue of Verité is by Nandita Basu, and that is Before I Die. And one of the things that struck me about this story is that it's an art style that is, I guess, more sparse than most of the other stories in this entire issue. I think it's the most sparse, really. And straightforward, almost cartoony, and I do not mean that in a negative way. But it also deals, though, I think of the Indian half, it's the more outright narrative. Yeah, we got Murthy's memoir, Please Do the Needful, that definitely has a storyline, but there seems to be more of at least a fictional narrative going on with Basu's Before I Die. But it also deals with some quite heavy subject matter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I agree with your description of the aesthetic, and I think in that sense, it's one of the stories that's pretty far afield from the alternative manga here and the kind of gekiga that's covered in Holmberg's essay. But I do think that, like you mentioned, it tackles really kind of substantive subject matter. And I think in its way, in that way, like thematically, I think it is very close to some of these other gekiga stories that we have here.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned Holmberg's essay. Now, what closes out at least the Indian half, or the left to right portion of this issue of Verité, is an essay by Ryan Holmberg called The Eye of the Storm, Speedlines and Gekiga FX. And so, again, this is yet another example of the insightful and very accessible analysis of Holmberg. I really do enjoy his writing, and I think it's an interesting topic, because usually when I've read his essays in his own collections essay that he translates and edits, it's about the creator that he's pulling together the work from. Okay. Right. So, last month back in August when we looked at Slumwolf. So he was writing about Tsuge and Tsuge's choice of subject matter and why that was so significant. Now here he's writing broadly about gekiga. So he's looking at the history of manga, but doing it in a way that's kind of different from at least the other essays that I'm familiar with. And instead of looking primarily at one creator, he's looking at, I guess, an aesthetic characteristic of a certain kind of manga from a certain historical period, or at least giving its historical roots, the speed lines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is, it's interesting that you point that out. I've read a couple of the essays that he's, obviously I've read the essays in the collections that he's edited. But I've also read a couple of the essays he's published at the Comics Journal, and I'm trying to think if I've ever read anything of his that's like this. But I think this is the first essay of his that I've read that isn't devoted specifically to one cartoonist. And so it was interesting to see him writing about this aesthetic kind of trope, if we want to call it that kind of reiterates throughout all of these mangaka working in komaga or gekiga, the alternative manga of the 60s and 70s. So it was really interesting to see not only his kind of take on that, because obviously he's very knowledgeable about this subject, and so that was interesting. But it was also interesting to see him write something that kind of had a bit of a wider berth than some of the more narrowly focused essays of his that I've read.
Yes, exactly. So what did you think of this first issue of Verité? Overall, as a collection, as a new project.
As a project, I'm really interested in it. I think this attempt to kind of blend contemporary Indian cartooning and older Japanese cartooning is really interesting, and to kind of draw the connections between those two for readers, I think is interesting. And as an issue, I liked it quite a bit as well. I wasn't, surprisingly, I wasn't too keen on the Tadao Tsuge story included here. I mean, it was fine. It was okay. I don't think it was my favorite Tsuge story. I just didn't have strong feelings about it one way or the other. And then the Katsumata story, we had read before because we had read Fukuyama Devilfish, which I don't think speaks about the quality of the collection or the magazine. But just for my own personal experience, it would have been nice to have seen something, new, even new from Katsumata, because I hadn't read this Tsuge story, obviously, but I'd read other Tsuge stuff. But the other stories, by Youji Tsuneyama and the story, The Ritualist Shop by Yukichi Yamamatsu that we talked about, I thought those were really interesting as well. So I'm glad I got the opportunity to read those. The Yamamatsu story in particular was interesting because of the way that it blended some of these older gekiga sensibilities with a more kind of contemporary voice,
and an Indian setting.
Yeah, so that was interesting, and again, I'm really glad I got the opportunity to read it. But I do think the stories that I felt strongest about in the collection were from this left to right half, or this Indian half. Some of the stories we talked about, like Night Swimming, or The Student, or other stories like we hadn't talked about, like the Alcazar, I thought were really, really fantastic. I will admit I'm not the hugest fan of the cartooning style of this in the story. We talked about Research Ramblings. So that one I kind of am non-committal on, but I think there were a good 3 or 4 stories in this Indian half that I was just totally blown away by. So I really enjoyed the experience of reading it. Even the stories I didn't like, it was interesting to see contemporary comics from Indian cartoonists, just because, as I mentioned, that's a kind of scene that I'm totally ignorant about. So just even stories that didn't really click with me, it was I'm glad I got the chance to kind of engage with them. But yeah, I think overall, I really am excited to see where this goes as a project, because I like I mentioned, it's got really, really interesting goals of kind of bridging these two comics communities, and I think as an issue, I was really, really I had fun with it. There were stories I liked a lot, and stories, just like with any other anthology, there were stories I didn't really like so much, and stories I was totally blown away by. So yeah, I think overall I'm really interested to see where this project goes, and I'm really glad we got a chance to read this and talk about it for the show.
I want to say something real quick about your comment on Samvatsar's Research Ramblings. And I understand it may not be a kind of art that particularly draws you. I mean, I thought if the protagonist is an animator, then it only makes sense that we get the kind of art that we do, because the style is something like you would find in animation.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I don't mean to say that the art is in any way bad or ill-suited for the story. Quite the opposite. In fact, I think it's I think it's very well suited for the story, and I think that there are some really interesting things going on with some of the personifications. I think Shaunak does. I think he uses those things like personifying the administrator of the university as a kind of cobra who, and everyone in the auditorium during this meeting is a pig, and then the the academics who fail to kind of publish adequately are pigs being roasted. So I think there's some really interesting stuff going on there that I think is really effective, and I think I don't know how I want to say this. I think it lends itself very well to the content of the story as well. So I don't mean to say that the art is bad. I just don't think it's necessarily to my taste. Mm-hmm. But I'm sure there were a couple stories in here that you would say something similar about.
Yeah. I think I appreciated the older manga more than you did. So I know you said you weren't really bowled away by Tsuge's Old Woman of Kinikoya. I really liked that story. That seemed to have, maybe because it was the first one I read, it is why it had kind of impact it did on me. But also, and this is, I think, the first thing I have read of Tsuneyama, the Mizue's Town, which is about, this prostitute who is pursued by a John who sees her as more than just someone to buy for a night. Right. And he loves her, and it's what he's willing to do for her, and how that affects her. And I think that the ending, which I don't want to give away, was just outstanding when we see that she's with someone else, but there's something that she has on that really does wrap up the story nicely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I thought that story was good as well. Though, the reproductions of the art seem to be not quite as clear, and this may be just an aspect of Tsuneyama's cartooning,
or the accessibility or the quality of the original.
Yeah, that might be it as well. So I think I would have liked to have seen a slightly cleaner reproduction of that story. But I did really enjoy that story. And it, like you, not only had I never read anything by Tsuneyama, but I had never heard the name before. So that, and then, like I mentioned, the Rituella shot by Yukichi Yamamatsu, were really pleasant surprises, primarily because I thought they were both good stories, and they were by cartoonists who I had never encountered before. So I didn't really know what to expect going in, but I thought both delivered quite nicely. Mm-hmm.
And if people want to find this first inaugural issue of Verité, they should go to the website, the blog comicsindia.org, and that's one word, comixindia.org. And there you can find out more information, not only about Indian comics, but also, I guess in particular, this first issue of Verité, and can even order a copy. It's $20, and outside of India, you can pay for it via PayPal. And I want to thank once again the editor, Bharath Murthy, for getting in touch with us and alerting us to Verité and sending us copies to use in this episode of the podcast. It was quite different from the titles we normally get a chance to look at. So I'm really glad that he was able to send us copies. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's look at the second title that we're going to be looking at on this episode, our, I guess, officially the September show in October. And this is another of Seven Seas Entertainment's classic series. This year they've been coming out with these nice hardbound collection of classic manga. Just last month, or back in August, we discussed the first volume in the Captain Harlock series. That's a part of this, Captain Harlock Classic Collection Volume 1. We also have, or Seven Seas Entertainment has put out Devilman by the creator of the book that we're discussing right now, and that is Cutie Honey, the classic collection. And this is by Go Nagai. Is that how you pronounce his name? Nagai?
Yes, that's how I've been pronouncing it.
Yeah.
So.
And in fact, one of the things that Ryan Holmberg told me when I met him at SPX the other week is that he said a rule of thumb is when pronouncing Japanese names, if you're going to accent any syllable, it's usually the first. He says that sometimes you guys get it right, sometimes you don't. But again, I mean, he's a student. He is a scholar in Japanese, not only comics, but culture. We're not. We claim ignorance and we make mistakes. But yeah, thanks, Ryan, for that suggestion. Yeah. So yeah, anyway, so this is Go Nagai, Cutie Honey, the classic collection. A couple of questions to start off with. And maybe it's a way for us to get into this text. Had you read any Cutie Honey before? And then along with that, were you familiar with any other comics by Go Nagai, such as Devilman?
So I had never read any Cutie Honey before. I was kind of sort of familiar with the character. I'd heard the name before. I know that there was a live action movie because I'm a fan of Hideki Anno, who directed it. So I was kind of aware of it. I knew it was this Go Nagai property. I knew it was an anime in the 70s. I sort of had some inkling that the character was a sort of robot superhero, but I didn't really know much beyond that. To answer your second question, I had never. This was the first Go Nagai comic I had ever read. And that's partly due because I think, from what I understand, his titles have been not really available in English for a good while, or they've been available intermittently. But I was familiar with Devilman. I had seen the recent Devilman anime on Netflix, Devilman Crybaby, by Masaki Yuasa. And then after that, I had watched that not because I had a particular interest in Devilman, but because I'm a huge fan of Yuasa's, but because I like that show so much, or the series so much, I did end up watching the original Devilman anime. So I had seen that, and so I was kind of familiar. I'm more familiar with Devilman than I was with Cutie Honey, but I hadn't gotten a chance yet to actually read any of the Devilman manga. What about you? How familiar with Go Nagai were you before reading this?
Probably very similar to your experience. I had heard of Go Nagai in both Devilman and Cutie Honey. Actually, I think that I first learned about Cutie Honey. Oh, God, maybe it was last year when you and I looked at the, what was that? Mangasia, that book. And I think it was mentioned in that collection, or maybe I read about it someplace else. But, being on the Seven Seas Entertainment mailing list, I had known that these classic collections, not only the Go Nagai ones, but, the, Captain Harlock collections were going to be coming out. They were announcing those, quite ahead of schedule. And so I was looking forward to this. And I know that there was a more recent Cutie Honey book that came out from Seven Seas Entertainment. Cutie Honey A Go-Go, that came out back in March. But I think that was Anno Hideki taking the Go Nagai property and doing kind of a more contemporary thing. But this is, as the subtitle of this text suggests, the classic collection. So this is classic Cutie Honey. And Cutie Honey originally ran in the early 70s, from 1973 to 1974. There were only 2 volumes of the original manga, and I guess in this complete collection, or this classic collection, we have both volumes. And even though it is a substantive piece, I mean, is what, over 475 pages, it seemed to read fairly quickly.
I thought it was. I thought it was a pretty breezy read. I even started to think that maybe it was a sort of model for some of the more contemporary shonen series, where you'll have like, I think there's like a fight sequence in one piece that like takes place. It's like 2 whole volumes or something like that. So I started to think that, especially towards the end of this book, that maybe this was a sort of precursor, forerunner to that sort of sensibility. But it's a pretty breezy series. It's a pretty action packed series. It's very classic shonen. So there's a lot of action, a lot of fights. And that occupies a lot of the content, but I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing.
No. And in fact, I really enjoyed this. Now, to me, one of the things that really, really stands out about Cutie Honey is the sexual stuff, and I want to talk about that in a moment. But in a nutshell, what we have with the Cutie Honey storyline is, and we see this at the very beginning, that Honey's father, who is a scientist, Kisaragi, we see him at the very beginning, or we see Honey like hooked up to electrodes, and it's basically Kisaragi creating his daughter Honey. And we learn what kind of creation she is soon enough. So as you point out, she's a robot, or she's an android, but she is a special kind of android that is able, if she touches, she has a choker collar with a heart on it. And if she touches that heart on her throat and says, what, honey flash or flash honey, then she changes. And, oh God, what is the process?
It's an airborne element solidifier.
That's right, the airborne element solidifier. And what that does is it takes, I guess, the molecules around her and transforms things like her clothing, her weapons, and whatnot in ways to suit whatever context she's in. So, for instance, if she needs to fight the evil force in this book, which is called Panther Claw, then, part of the transformation involves weapons, and a certain kind of battle clothing. There's another part where she is visiting a young man by the name of Seiji in a hospital. And so she dresses, when she transforms as a nurse. And so she has a nurse's uniform on, and she looks quite different than she normally would as Honey or as Cutie Honey. Now, Cutie Honey is, I guess, the heroic name that she's given, but her real name, I guess, or her human name is Honey Kisaragi, again, named after, her father is Professor Kisaragi. So he creates her and then sends her off to this boarding school, an all-women's boarding school in the middle of nowhere. And she learns later on why she was sent to the middle of nowhere, because her father didn't want Panther Claw, this evil force, to get its hands on what's it called again? The solidifier?
The airborne element solidifier.
Yeah, airborne element solidifier, which is inside of her, right? So the technology is part of who she is. And so he sends her off to this boarding school to keep her out of harm's way. Of course, it doesn't really work. They find out where she goes to school. And it's primarily what we have in Cutie Honey is Honey's engagement with Panther Claw. And Panther Claw, first and foremost, they just have the most horrendous outfits. I guess one of their leaders has as a hat, I guess, the claw of a panther on her head. And this is an all-female group, by the way. And it just seemed really weird to have the panther claw on the head. But then again, there's a lot that's weird about Cutie Honey.
Yeah, I think to address the sexual stuff.
Okay, yeah, let's go there
briefly. I think that the attitudes regarding, or the series' attitudes regarding its depictions of young, and when I say young, I mean young, like teenage girls, like naked bodies. There's one chapter, I can't recall what chapter it is, but it ends with a panel that has a kind of insert from Go Nagai that's like, did you know that on October whatever of 1973, the Cutie Honey anime premiered? They really went for it with showing her naked body during the transformations. You should really check it out. And then there's like a short kind of note from Go Nagai at the end of the book where essentially the series came out of his desire to draw erotica and combine erotica with like science fiction. So that is a kind of foundational core element of the series where, and I think this is evident in reading it. There's so many panels of just characters turning, and we get a panel that's just their butt.
Yeah.
In the way that characters are kind of posing for the viewer, and the fact that we have so much nudity every time Cutie Honey transforms, and then we have a number of other characters that are stripped and put into kind of vaguely erotic scenarios. It's pretty clear that that naked women is one of the kind of points of the entire series is to see these topless women frequently.
Mm-hmm. And not just topless, it's also bottomless women at times. Well, it's interesting in that it starts off with a naked Cutie Honey, the android who's hooked up to all these electrodes, again, naked, and her father is there in her presence. Now, he is her creator / father, and so it's not unusual for a parent to see a child naked. But with Cutie Honey as a character eroticized and sexualized throughout, it is a little weird to have the father standing there watching his naked creation. And at one point, she even says, once she awakens, she says, "Why don't I have any clothes on?" And it's like, well, good question. But then you're right. I mean, there are a variety of instances throughout this text where, especially in those moments of transformation, she becomes naked. And it's interesting in that we don't see her transform once she, touches the heart on her choker collar and says, "Honey Flash." It's not just her going from, let's say, Honey, the human, to whatever, outfit and weapons that she's wielding. But we see in that transformation, the transition from, the human Honey to naked, and then clothed and combative, so to speak, most times, Cutie Honey. And so there always has to be that nakedness that's thrown in there. To me, and I wanted to see what you thought of this, the strangest part of the book, especially when it comes to the eroticism, takes place about halfway through. Now, this is an occasion, and I'm looking particularly on pages, it begins on 254 and it lasts until about 263 or so. Cutie Honey has been captured by the Panther Claw. She ends up getting away, and it's been a while since she's had anything to eat. So in other words, she doesn't have the sustenance to power her transformation, and she has only enough energy left to assume a bronze appearance. So she makes her way to this park, and she transforms into a kind of a bronzish color so that she looks like a statue. And so as the Panther Claw are looking for her in this park, they think that she's a statue and, don't know otherwise. So anyway, she's standing there as a statue. And then along comes a couple of characters who are more comic relief than anything. You know, I mentioned earlier that someone who was, I guess he was a paper boy, Seiji, was with Professor Nasargi when he died. So when Seiji is in the hospital, we are introduced also to his brother Junpei and the father Hayami. Now, in the park, Hayami the father and the young son Junpei just happen to wander through, and they notice this, what they think of as a new statue, and they're very turned on by the statue. So you have the father that not only climbs on Cutie Honey, whom he thinks is a statue, but starts sucking on her nipples and says, wow, this has a very different texture and feel than most statues do. And then if that weren't enough, the son Junpei starts to not only caress her in certain areas, but he, how shall I say this, goes down on Cutie Honey, and he's having a good time. And so she is being pleasured both in terms of her genitals, her breasts, and especially when Junpei starts to, let's say, indulge in her in the way that he does, it affects her. And she almost cannot hold the pose anymore because, I guess, of the stimulation she's receiving. That just seemed really weird to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think weird is a bit of an understatement. That was definitely one of the moments in the book where, you know, I would like to think if this was being made today, you know, the author would have the good sense not to include that, because it felt prurient in a way that went kind of beyond the I would describe almost all of the nudity in the series as gratuitous. But I think that was a moment where it went beyond simply being gratuitous, and it became quite uncomfortable, because you have this character who's ostensibly young student, 16-year-old, 17-year-old girl who is actually being kind of raped by this old man and his son, and they're not aware that that's what they're doing. They're just behaving like weird perverts who are like licking a statue. But it is a scene where she's being raped, and it's played for laughs. That was I will say the moment at the end where she she can't hold it anymore. She breaks and she's like, shut up and go away. Like, I want to stop being a statue, but you have to leave. I thought that was funny, but for the most part, that scene was, I'm not entirely sure why it went on so long or why it was even in the series, but it definitely felt like the sort of thing that was definitely from 1973.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned that, Hayami and his son Junpei seem to come across as comic relief. And I think this is where their role as comic relief comes into focus with the eroticism that's obviously behind what Go Nagai is doing with not just this scene, but I think with all of Cutie Honey. But I think that this particular scene in the park where, the father and son think she's a statue, they start to caress her, suck on her, eating her out, so to speak. And as you point out, rape her, without realizing what they're doing. I mean, that was just gratuitous. And it was, to me, the one moment, or I guess the most egregious example of Go Nagai just breaking out with eroticism, just pure and simple. I mean, because that's what it is. And you're right. There is a comedic moment when she has to, break form and say, "Hey, get away!" And then they run off screaming because they're so shocked that that's not a statue, or that the statue is talking, what they think of as a statue. But yeah, I mean, that is the most, I guess, egregious example of the eroticism that is woven throughout Cutie Honey, the classic collection. Now, I am not a prude or a Puritan by any stretch of the imagination, and I have nothing wrong with storytelling, whether it be in comics form or otherwise, that has that kind of erotic, even cheesecakey feel to it. It doesn't offend me. It may make me uncomfortable in places, like, for instance, the statue scene that we were just describing. But, when we were discussing a moment ago the first issue of Verité, and I had mentioned that story by Anpu Varkey, Night Swimming, I said I couldn't get that REM song out of my head for a while. I have to say, the song that was stuck in my head after reading Cutie Honey was the Rolling Stones' Little TNA from their Tattoo You album.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good description of the series. I think like I wouldn't say that I'm offended by the kind of obvious erotic motivations at work here. I will say that scene where she's a statue is, I think, I don't want to say an exception, because I don't think that scene offended me quite so much as it did make me quite a bit uncomfortable, because
you squirmed.
Because on the one hand, you have these characters who aren't aware of what they're doing, but then, as readers, especially readers, 40 years removed, when attitudes about sex have changed quite a bit, or in certain respects they've changed. As readers in the here and now, it's difficult to not look at that and feel a little like, I know this is supposed to be funny. It's intended to be funny, but it's really not quite so funny. It's just kind of uncomfortable.
I bet if Brett Kavanaugh read this, he wouldn't be uncomfortable. To be quite timely.
Oh, well, maybe I would. I don't know if I would feel more uncomfortable that a Supreme Court justice is fine with that, or if a Supreme Court justice is reading manga from the 70s rather than attending to more important concerns. I think reading this book was interesting. It's definitely got the sensibilities of a shonen manga from the 1970s, and I think that it was good to see that note from Go Nagai included at the end. Because at least he's forthcoming about why
he was doing what he did.
Right. The nature of the work. He's not trying to pretend as though this is a grand work of art. This is a grand masterpiece about the human condition. He's very upfront about why he created this and why he made the decisions he did. So, at least there's that. And I think there's another short, like 2-page little note from someone at the end that I think also does a good job of kind of contextualizing the series and making it clear that this was really a product of its time, and it was very popular, and it kind of it remains popular, right? They keep making these different manga and anime and even live action iterations of the series, because it is something designed specifically to appeal to kind of young boys, and so it has that appeal because of its kind of overt erotic or softcore overtures. Even stuff that's not explicit in the series, right? Like, one of the things we haven't talked about is this preponderance of characters who are women or young girls who have sex with other women simply because those are the only other people who are around, or they look at Cutie Honey and there's a moment where one of the characters, Sister Jill, watching her transform, and she says outright, like, "Oh my God, am I a lesbian? Like, does this make me a lesbian?" So beyond even the kind of visual eroticism of the naked women, there is that implicit eroticism throughout. That's kind of hinting at and suggesting at women having sex with other women, and ooh, isn't that hot, young boys? So I do think this is very much the sort of thing that it knows who it's for, and I think it successfully makes kind of appeals to that intended audience. Though, from what I understand, a lot of those erotic elements are downplayed in some of the other adaptations. So it might just be that Go Nagai is a weird pervert.
Yeah, what you mentioned about the girls' school and the women, younger as well as teachers, the older ones, engaged, so to speak, with other women because that's all that's around them. And the eroticism behind that, it reminded me of a very early scene in the book. And this is right when Honey goes to the school. And so she's, we get a scene with, she's called Alphonse Sensei. So she's a teacher. And she is standing up in front of the class and saying that she wants to introduce a brand new student. And it's someone that, because someone asks one of the students, is she pretty? And you're right. All of the students there are taken by Honey because she is so attractive. And so they go gaga over her, but not near as gaga as Alphonse Sensei goes, because when in answering the question that a student asks, is she pretty? Then the sensei says, I'm a woman. She grabs her own breasts and then says, I'm a woman, but she makes me feel things against my will. My body throbs. What a vision. And then she squeezes, of course, this is the sound effect of squish, squish, her breasts as she falls down on the floor, and she flips. It's as if she's having an orgasm in front of her students as she is describing Cutie Honey, or Honey coming into the classroom. And then all the students, when they see her, they go gaga, and they all but have orgasms, it seems. So, right. I mean, there is kind of a weirdness. Again, this word weird, I think, is something that we should underscore with this. Now, that being said, I mean, I enjoyed Cutie Honey. I thought it was fun, disturbing and unsettling at times, but nonetheless, it was an enjoyable read for me.
I agree with that. That's sort of my experience as well. I think there are plenty of moments in the book that I had to kind of bracket and roll my eyes at, simply because, very quickly it just becomes so gratuitous. And that might be I might not have picked up on that so quickly if I hadn't been reading this in one kind of sitting, if I'd been reading this week to week or month to month, the way it was serialized originally. But it did seem to be like that there was a sort of roteness to the nudity that, as though Go Nagai, like every month he's like, I gotta have a couple panels of naked women, there's like a quota he's got to fill, or something like that. So there's definitely moments that I kind of had to put off to the side and kind of look at in shame and hope, wish that, if this series had been produced contemporarily, there wouldn't be quite so much gratuitous nudity. But I enjoyed it as well. And part of that is, we talked about this, the kind of prurient quality that we're talking about, the gratuitous nudity, is this product of trying to make these erotic appeals to young boys. These softcore, the softcore eroticism that's both kind of transgressing certain lines, and so it is sort of dangerous and thrilling, but it's not too explicit, right? So it's still something that could conceivably be read by a young teenage boy. But the other side of that is he makes these appeals to young boys in terms of action as well, right? And so we talked about how this series. The book is a pretty quick read, and part of that is because there's so much action, and I think the action in the series is really great, and there's a kind of extremity there. I mean, I was really shocked by how extreme some of the violence gets in this. I mean, there's decapitations, there's Cutie, cuts some people in half. And I guess it's all it's the sort of Samurai Jack rule, where because she's fighting other robots, she can be as violent towards them as she wants, and it's okay because she's not harming quote unquote humans. But I mean, there's kind of blood and viscera all over the place, and it is it's a really shocking. There's one great panel where she sort of stabs someone in the back, and the sound effect is there's like blood, this kind of inky blood spatter coming out of his back. That's really great, and the sound effect is like splorch or something. So I think I think those moments, the fights, the action, I think are really fun. They're really well drawn. They've got a great dynamic sense of movement to them. And they're, like I said, I was really kind of taken aback by just like, whoa, this is this is really violent for a shonen comic from the early 1970s. I think because of that, because of those elements, I ended up really, really enjoying the series as well.
Yeah. And, you were mentioning some of the violence, and I know we focused mostly on the sex stuff. But yeah, there's some of that violence there as well. But, I was thinking in terms of the sex, gratuitous or otherwise, that we find in Cutie Honey, the classic collection. I'm disturbed less by what I read in this book than by some of the more, let's say, contemporary manga, and, most of which we haven't even discussed on the manga series. But, there are certain publishers that tend to, it seems, almost specialize in manga that features younger women or girls, but they're presented in an unrealistic, uber Barbie-esque way. In other words, their breasts are overly gigantic, very thin waist. In other words, these are little girls who were sexualized. To me, that's much more creepy and disturbing than what I see in the Cutie Honey collection.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I think there are innumerable series. There are a couple titles we've talked about on the show over the years that kind of fit this description. But yeah, I think you're right. I think there is a tendency in certain manga or manga for certain audiences to I think to very heavily sexualize these characters who are explicitly very young girls. And so any criticisms I may have about Cutie Honey, I don't want that to make it seem as though I think this is worse or somehow I don't want this to seem as though I think Cutie Honey is less creepy or less problematic for those reasons than some of those contemporary titles that, though they're not quite as explicit, right? Like we may not see any topless women in those series. There is a kind of more explicit and more pronounced kind of sexualization of these young women. I think there's like I said, innumerable titles that I think are deeply, deeply problematic for precisely that reason.
So we looked at two really interesting titles for the quote-unquote September episode of the manga series. We started off with the inaugural issue of a new publication, Vérité. It's edited by Bharath Murthy, and this was a collection of some classic manga, even some contemporary manga, and Indian comics. Mm-hmm. And then we wrapped up with a discussion of Cutie Honey, the classic collection by Go Nagai, and that came out in late August from Seven Seas Entertainment. A lot of interesting stuff to chew over.
Yeah, I think two interesting titles, two very different titles.
Mm-hmm. And if you want to find great manga like the kind that we've been discussing, then definitely check out the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. Every month they have great deals on a variety of manga and other comics. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your titles there, get in touch with us and let me and Shea know what kind of manga you're going to be reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you could leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way. Pick up your phone and dial 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
And you can always email us at twoguys@comicsalternative.com. If you want to email me directly, you can email me at shay@comicsalternative.com. And Derek, what is your email address?
Derek@comicsalternative.com. You can also find us all over social media. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on Google Podcasts, on iHeartRadio, and on TuneIn. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com. So there you go. And as we mentioned at the top of the show, Shea and I will be back later this month for our October horror manga show. So listen up for it. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
Take care.
流行りの女の子はお尻の小さな女の子はこっちを向いてよハニーだってなんだかだってなんだもんお願いお願い傷つけないで私のハートはチュクチュクしちゃうの人気の女の子は福とコインの女の子はこっちを向いてよハニーだってなんだかだってなんだもんお願いお願い近寄らないで私のお花がヒクヒクしちゃうの